Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Introduction. Is the UN working against America? Shocking statement. The United States pours billions of dollars into the United Nations every year. But what if I told you that some of the very policies, resolutions, and actions of the UN often seem to work against American interests? Is the US bankrolling an institution that undermines its own global influence? Overview. The UN's origins and purpose. To understand this paradox, we have to go back to 1945. The world had just emerged from the deadliest war in human history. The United Nations was established with one core mission: to maintain international peace and prevent another global conflict like World War II. With the US as one of its founding members and strongest advocates, the organization was seen as a beacon of diplomacy, human rights, and cooperation. But fast forward to today, and the picture isn't so simple. Despite being the UN's largest financial contributor, funding nearly 1/5 of its entire budget, the US has frequently found itself at odds with UN policies, vetoed in key decisions, and even criticized by the very organization it funds. Paradox. America versus the UN. Here's the dilemma. The US plays a crucial role in keeping the UN running, yet it often disagrees with or outright opposes many of the UN's initiatives. From controversial resolutions in the General Assembly to disputes over climate policies, human rights, and international law, the United Nations has become both a diplomatic tool and a battleground for competing global interests, including those that don't always align with America's. Thesis statement: what this video will cover. So, is the UN truly serving America's interests, or is the US funding an organization that works against it? In this video, we'll break down the history of America's role in the UN, how much money the US actually spends on the UN and where it goes, the major conflicts between the UN and American policies, and ultimately, whether this massive investment is worth it. Stay tuned because by the end of this video, you'll have a whole new perspective on America's role in the United Nations and whether it's time for a change. The origins. Why the US helped create. The UN visual black and white footage of WM destruction, bombed out cities, soldiers, and civilians in ruins. After nearly 6 years of war, the world was in shambles. Over 70 million people had died, civilians and soldiers alike. Entire cities were leveled. The Holocaust had revealed the depths of human cruelty, and the use of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved that future wars could wipe out humanity altogether. The League of Nations, formed after World War I to prevent future conflicts, had failed catastrophically. It lacked real power, had no standing military, and could not stop aggressor nations like Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan from plunging the world into another war. The world needed something stronger, something more effective. That's where the United Nations came in. The US takes the lead in drafting the UN Charter visual, footage of the 1945 San Francisco Conference, historical photos of US diplomats at the negotiating table. In April 1945, even before World War II officially ended, delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter, the founding document of this new global organization. But there was one country leading the charge: the United States. The US played a pivotal role in shaping the structure of the UN. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had long envisioned a powerful international body to maintain peace, was one of its strongest advocates. The idea was clear: if the world could work together, another world war could be avoided. The UN Charter laid out the organization's core goals: maintain international peace and security, promote friendly relations among nations, protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, encourage social and economic development worldwide. The US helped ensure that the UN would have real power, unlike the League of Nations. It created the Security Council, where the world's major powers, the US, Soviet Union, now Russia, China, the UK, and France, would have permanent seats and veto power over major decisions. This gave America a direct hand in global diplomacy, while also preventing any one country from dominating world affairs. Why the US agreed to fund the UN at first glance. It might seem strange that the United States would commit so much money to an international organization. But there were three powerful reasons why America was willing to bankroll the UN. 1. Global stability, Pax U.S. security, visual, map of Cold War alliances, NATO formation, early UN peacekeeping missions. After World War II, America emerged as the most powerful nation in the world, but also one facing new threats, especially from the rising tensions of the Cold War. The UN provided a way to resolve conflicts diplomatically rather than through military confrontation. If countries could talk things out at the UN, they were less likely to go to war, which meant fewer threats to U.S. security. Economic interests, a stable world, a thriving U.S. economy. Visual, 1940s-50s boom in American industry, images of trade routes, container ships. America's economy depended on a stable global trade system. War, political instability, and failing economies threatened American business interests. By funding the UN's humanitarian efforts and peacekeeping missions, the U.S. helped stabilize economies worldwide, creating safer markets for American exports and international investments. The Marshall Plan, America's massive investment in rebuilding Europe after the war, was a perfect example of how stabilizing the world benefited the U.S. directly. A strong Europe meant strong trading partners, and the UN helped ensure that stability. Diplomatic leverage, the U.S. as a global leader. Visual, U.S. diplomats at the UN, General Assembly meetings, key moments in Cold War diplomacy. The U.S. understood that being the biggest contributor to the UN gave it significant influence. Funding the UN meant America could push its agenda on global issues, veto policies it disagreed with, and maintain a leadership role in international affairs. By being a major funder, the U.S. effectively bought a seat at the table in every major international decision. Whether it was negotiating peace treaties, imposing sanctions, or shaping humanitarian aid, America's financial commitment ensured that its voice mattered. Conclusion: a strategic move, not just charity. So why did the U.S. help create the UN and agree to fund it so heavily? The answer is simple: it was a strategic investment. The UN wasn't just about idealism. It was a powerful tool for America's global influence. It helped prevent future wars. It protected U.S. economic interests by stabilizing global trade. It gave America diplomatic leverage in international conflicts. But here's the big question: is that investment still paying off today? Because while the U.S. may have built the UN to serve global peace and its own interests, many argue that the organization has since drifted away from American priorities. In the next section, we'll look at how America's relationship with the UN has changed, and why so many U.S. leaders question whether it's still worth funding. America's financial commitment to the UN? A costly investment? Visual. Opening with a dramatic stat on screen: $12 billion per year, the U.S. bankrolls. The UN. The United States is by far the largest financial contributor to the United Nations. In fact, no other country comes close. The U.S. pays around 22% of the UN's regular operating budget and a staggering 27% of its peacekeeping budget. That's roughly $12 billion per year, more than the contributions of Germany, Japan, and the U.K. combined. But why does America pay so much more than everyone else? And with the UN frequently criticizing U.S. policies, is this money actually benefiting American interests? Let's break it all down. How much does the U.S. actually pay? 1. Regular budget contribution, 22% of the total UN budget. The UN operates on a regular budget, which funds its day-to-day operations, agencies, and initiatives like the World Health Organization, WHO, the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and the Human Rights Council. The total UN regular budget is around $3.4 billion per year. The U.S. contributes 22% of that, roughly $750 million annually. By comparison, China contributes 15.25%, while Japan and Germany each contribute around 8-9%. Essentially, America is paying for nearly a quarter of the UN's operations, while many countries, including economic powerhouses, pay significantly less. Peacekeeping. Budget. 27% of global UN peacekeeping costs. UN peacekeeping operations are Some of the most expensive aspects of the organization, requiring massive resources to maintain troops, logistics, and humanitarian aid in conflict zones. The total UN peacekeeping budget is about $6.1 billion per year. The U.S. is responsible for 27% of that, or $1.6 billion annually. The next largest contributors are China, 15.7%, and Japan, 8.0%. This means that when the UN deploys peacekeepers to regions like Africa, the Middle East, or Eastern Europe, over a quarter of the costs are shouldered by American taxpayers. Voluntary contributions, billions more. Beyond the mandatory regular and peacekeeping budgets, the U.S. also makes voluntary contributions to specific UN programs. Why does the U.S. pay so much more than other nations? The UN uses a scale of assessment system. The UN calculates each country's required contribution based on its economic strength, GDP, and ability to pay. Because the U.S. has the world's largest economy, it is assigned a higher percentage of the budget. The U.S. has historically accepted this role. Since the UN's founding in 1945, the U.S. has agreed to take on a leadership role, arguing that a stable international system benefits American economic and security interests. Other countries simply don't pay as much. Many countries underpay or delay payments, making the UN more dependent on the U.S. to cover budget shortfalls. The UN's dependency on U.S. money. Despite constant criticism for an organization that relies heavily on American funding, the UN often clashes with U.S. policies. Anti-American resolutions. The UN General Assembly frequently votes against U.S. positions on foreign policy, trade, and military action. In 2017, 128 countries voted to condemn America's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, despite many of those same nations receiving U.S. aid. The UN Human Rights Council has repeatedly condemned U.S. actions on immigration, Guantanamo Bay, and drone warfare, despite including countries with questionable human rights records. 2. Security Council gridlock. Even though the U.S. is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it often finds itself blocked by Russia and China, limiting its influence. Many resolutions America supports, such as sanctions against rogue nations, are vetoed by geopolitical rivals. 3. Peacekeeping missions that often fail. The U.S. funds 27% of peacekeeping missions, but many have been ineffective or controversial. High-profile failures include Rwanda, 1994, where UN forces failed to stop a genocide, and Bosnia, 1995, where UN peacekeepers were unable to prevent massacres. Is this investment still worth it? For decades, the U.S. justified its massive UN funding as a way to maintain global stability, protect American interests, and promote diplomacy. But with mounting criticism and questionable effectiveness, many U.S. leaders have started asking, should America keep funding the UN at these levels? Some argue yes, saying that the UN helps prevent global chaos and ensures America maintains a leadership role in world affairs. Others argue no, claiming that the UN has become an expensive bureaucracy that often works against U.S. interests. What do you think? Should America continue paying billions to fund the UN, or is it time to reconsider its role? Cases of the UN working against U.S. interests. The United Nations was founded with the goal of promoting global peace and cooperation, and the U.S. has been its biggest financial backer since day one. But what happens when the organization America funds so heavily consistently opposes U.S. policies and interests? From anti-American resolutions to controversial UN agencies and peacekeeping failures, the UN has often clashed with U.S. foreign policy, sometimes in ways that seem to undermine American leadership. Let's break down how and why the UN has worked against U.S. interests. A. Anti-American resolutions and voting patterns. 1. Of the biggest complaints about the UN is that the U.S. funds it, but gets little support in return. The numbers, UN votes, often oppose the U.S. The UN General Assembly, where all 193 member states vote on resolutions, has repeatedly passed measures that go against U.S. positions. A study found that, on average, the UN General Assembly votes against U.S. interests about 70% of the time. A report from the Heritage Foundation found that in recent years, Israel-related issues. The U.S. opposed 87% of UN resolutions on Israel. Sanctions on Cuba. The UN almost unanimously votes against the U.S. embargo every year. Iran-related issues. Many countries vote against U.S. sanctions and favor more diplomatic approaches. Key example, the 2017 Jerusalem Resolution. In 2017, after the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, 128 countries voted in the UN to condemn the decision, including U.S. allies like France, Germany, and the U.K. Only 9 nations supported the U.S., despite many of them receiving American aid. Key example, UN votes against U.S.-Cuba policy. The U.S. has imposed sanctions on Cuba for decades, citing human rights violations and authoritarian rule. Yet, the UN General Assembly votes every year to condemn these sanctions, with only the U.S. and Israel typically opposing the resolution. Security Council veto battles. Unlike the General Assembly, the UN Security Council, where the U.S. has a permanent seat and veto power, deals with major global decisions like sanctions, military actions, and peacekeeping missions. The problem? The U.S. often finds its efforts blocked by rival nations like China and Russia, who also have veto power. Example, Syria conflict. The U.S. pushed for sanctions on Syria in response to chemical weapon attacks. Russia and China vetoed it. Example, Iran sanctions dispute. In 2020, the U.S. tried to extend arms sanctions against Iran over its nuclear program. The UN Security Council rejected it, with Russia and China voting against the U.S. So even though the U.S. funds 22% of the UN's budget, it frequently faces opposition from both allies and rivals in the organization. B. UN agencies. Challenging U.S. policies beyond General Assembly votes. Specific UN agencies have repeatedly clashed with the U.S., sometimes favoring America's adversaries over its allies. UN Human Rights Council, UNHRC. Bias against U.S. and allies. The UN Human Rights Council, UNHRC, is supposed to monitor and promote human rights worldwide. But critics argue it has a long history of bias against the U.S. and its allies, especially Israel, while ignoring major human rights abusers. The UNHRC has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than against Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Combined key examples. 2018. The UNHRC passed 5 resolutions condemning Israel in one session, but none against China, despite its mass detention of Uyghur Muslims. 2019. The UNHRC condemned U.S. border policies while ignoring human rights abuses in Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea. Membership controversy. Countries like China, Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela, all known for human rights violations, have been elected to the Human Rights Council, while the U.S. has faced intense criticism. In 2018, the U.S. withdrew from the UNHRC, calling it a cesspool of political bias. 2. World Health Organization, WHO, COVID-19 controversy. The World Health Organization, WHO, is another major UN agency that has clashed with the U.S., particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Key issues. WHO was criticized for being too deferential to China in the early stages of the pandemic. The U.S. accused WHO of delaying key warnings about COVID-19, leading to global spread. 2020, the Trump administration froze U.S. funding to WHO, calling it China-centric and demanding reforms. Despite the controversy, the U.S. remains the WHO's largest funder, contributing hundreds of millions each year. C. Peacekeeping failures and corruption. While the U.S. pays 27% of the UN's peacekeeping budget, many UN peacekeeping missions have been costly failures, sometimes causing more harm than good. Rwanda, 1994. Failure to stop genocide. The UN had peacekeepers in Rwanda when the genocide began, but they were ordered not to intervene. 800,000 people were slaughtered in just 100 days. The UN later admitted its mission was a disastrous failure. 2. Bosnia, 1995, Srebrenica massacre. UN peacekeepers were supposed to protect civilians in Bosnia. In Srebrenica, UN forces failed to stop Serbian forces, leading to the massacre of over 8,000 men and boys. 3. Haiti, 2010-2016. UN introduced cholera epidemic. After the 2010 earthquake, UN peacekeepers were sent to Haiti for aid and security. Instead, they introduced a deadly cholera outbreak that killed 10,000+ people. The UN refused to take responsibility for years. 4. Peacekeeper scandals, abuse and corruption. Sexual exploitation. UN peacekeepers have been accused of sexually abusing local women and children in missions from Congo to Haiti. Financial corruption. Billions in peacekeeping funds have disappeared due to fraud, mismanagement, and bureaucratic waste. Despite these issues, the U.S. is still expected to foot the bill, raising the question, are these missions worth the cost? Final thoughts. Is the UN helping or hurting the U.S.? The U.S. was instrumental in creating the UN, and for decades it funded it under the belief that it promoted peace and stability, but with frequent opposition to U.S. policies. UN. Agencies working against American interests, billions spent on peacekeeping missions that often fail. Many are asking, is the UN still serving U.S. interests, or is it time to rethink America's role? What do you think? Should the U.S. continue funding the UN at current levels, or should it cut back and focus on its own national interests? Why does the U.S. still fund the UN? The United Nations often clashes with U.S. policies, yet America continues to be its largest financial backer, contributing billions every year. This raises a critical question. If the UN frequently works against U.S. interests, why does Washington keep funding it? The answer lies in geopolitical strategy, diplomatic influence, and fears of what happens if America pulls out. Let's break down the real reasons the U.S. still funds the UN and the potential consequences of withdrawing support. A. The strategic benefits of U.S. funding. Despite its flaws, the UN still offers America several strategic advantages in the global arena. Example: sanctions and global consensus. The U.S. used the UN to legitimize sanctions against North Korea and Iran, increasing pressure on these regimes. If the UN didn't exist, America would have to act alone, making sanctions less effective. The UN helps maintain global order. For all its failures, the UN still plays a key role in preventing conflicts, managing trade relations, and enforcing international laws, preventing world wars. The UN's system of diplomacy and peacekeeping has helped avoid major global wars since 1945. Stability in global trade. The U.S. benefits from UN-affiliated organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, which sets trade rules that protect American economic interests. Preventing refugee crises and terrorism. The UN stabilizes fragile regions, e.g., Africa, the Middle East, reducing the risk of terrorism and mass migration toward the U.S. Example, the U.S. and the UN in Afghanistan. While America led the military effort in Afghanistan, UN agencies helped with reconstruction, humanitarian aid, and governance. Without the UN, the U.S. would have shouldered the entire burden alone, an expensive and difficult task. B. The alternative. What happens if the U.S. withdraws? If the U.S. stops funding the UN, what happens next? China becomes the dominant. Global player China is already increasing its influence in the UN. If the U.S. pulls out, China would likely step in, filling the power vacuum. China has boosted its UN contributions. It now funds 15.7% of UN peacekeeping and aims to control more agencies. Beijing has used the UN to push its own policies, such as blocking investigations into human rights abuses in Xinjiang. If America leaves, China could reshape global rules in ways that undermine U.S. interests. Example: China's growing role in the UN. China has taken leadership of 4 major UN agencies, more than any other country. It has used this influence to block Taiwan's participation, expand its Belt and Road Initiative, and silence critics of its human rights abuses. Would America really want to hand the UN over to China without a fight? 2. The collapse of international organizations leads to chaos. History shows what happens when global institutions fall apart, and it's not pretty. Example: the failure of the League of Nations. After World War I, the League of Nations was created to prevent another global war. The US refused to join, and major powers withdrew funding. The League collapsed in the 1930s, failing to stop the rise of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. The result? World War II. Without the UN, would the world descend into chaos like it did in the 1930s? Bah. The US would have to act alone in future conflicts. If the UN weakens, the burden of global peacekeeping would shift entirely to the US. America would have to deploy troops, provide humanitarian aid, and enforce international law without global support. This would cost even more than the $12 billion the US currently spends on the UN. Example: the Iraq War and Coalition of the Willing. In 2003, the UN refused to back the Iraq War. The US had to act alone, leading to strained alliances and massive financial military costs. If the UN were completely gone, how many more wars would the US have to fight alone? C. Is there a middle ground? Reforming. Instead of leaving, given these risks, some argue the US shouldn't abandon the UN, but should push for reforms to make it more accountable. Pressuring the UN to reduce American costs. The US could demand a lower financial contribution and require other wealthy nations, like China and Germany, to pay more. Holding corrupt UN agencies accountable. America could cut funding to ineffective agencies, like the UNHRC, while supporting programs that align with US interests. Using US leverage to control the UN's direction. As the biggest donor, the US still has the power to push for leadership positions in key UN agencies, ensuring American interests remain protected. Instead of quitting the game, should the US play smarter and demand reforms? Final thoughts. Should the US keep funding the UN? The case for leaving. The UN often works against US interests, wastes American tax dollars, and supports anti-American resolutions. The case for staying. The UN gives America diplomatics power, maintains global stability, and prevents China from taking over as the dominant force. Would cutting funding free America from a broken system, or would it create bigger problems for the US in the long run? What do you think? Should the US continue funding the UN, push for reforms, or withdraw entirely? The debate. Should America keep paying billions to the UN? The United States spends billions of dollars every year funding the United Nations, more than any other country. Yet despite this financial support, the UN often criticizes US policies, opposes American interests, and fails to deliver on key global issues. This raises a major question. Should America continue funding the UN, or is it time to pull out and invest elsewhere? Let's break down both sides of the argument, the case for keeping the UN and the case for cutting funding, and explore whether there's a better alternative for US global leadership. The case for funding, the UN, why America should keep paying billions. Despite its flaws, supporters argue that the UN is essential for global stability, diplomacy, and protecting US influence on the world stage. A. The UN maintains global stability. One of the UN's primary functions is preventing global chaos, conflicts, and economic instability. If the US cuts funding or leaves, the world could become more dangerous and unpredictable. Preventing global wars and conflicts. The UN was founded after World War II to stop another global catastrophe. Even with its failures, it has helped prevent large-scale wars through peacekeeping missions, diplomatic pressure, and conflict resolution. Without the UN, international disputes might escalate into full-scale wars that the US would have to deal with alone. Example: the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The UN played a role in de-escalating tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. The ability to negotiate through the UN helped avoid nuclear war. Managing humanitarian crises. UN agencies like the World Food Program, WFP, and UNICEF provide food, medical aid, and disaster relief worldwide. Without US funding, these programs could collapse, worsening global refugee crises and conflicts. Example: Syrian civil war, 2011-present. The UN coordinated relief efforts for millions of displaced people, reducing pressure on the US and European nations to handle the crisis alone. B. The UN gives the U.S. diplomatic power. The UN provides America with a platform to influence global policies, build alliances, and legitimize its actions. Shaping international law and policy. The U.S. uses the UN to pass resolutions on key global issues like nuclear weapons, sanctions, and climate agreements. If America pulls out, other nations, China, Russia, EU, will set the rules instead. Example: Iran nuclear sanctions, 2010. The U.S. secured global sanctions against Iran through the UN, pressuring Tehran to limit its nuclear program. Building coalitions for military actions. When the U.S. wants to take military action, UN approval gives it international legitimacy. Without it, American interventions look like unilateral aggression, damaging global support. Example: Gulf War 1991 vs. Iraq War 2003. In 1991, U.S. action in Iraq had UN approval, leading to a broad coalition. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq without UN backing, causing global backlash and weakening alliances. C. Without U.S. funding, China gains more power. If the U.S. cuts funding, China is waiting to fill the void, which could be even worse for American interests. China is already increasing its contributions and has taken control of several key UN agencies. If the U.S. withdraws, China will reshape the UN to serve its own authoritarian agenda. Example: China's influence in the UN. China has blocked investigations into human rights abuses in Xinjiang using its UN influence. It has expanded its Belt and Road Initiative through UN-backed infrastructure deals. Would America rather stay and fight for influence or surrender the UN to China? The case against funding. The UN: why America should cut ties and invest elsewhere. Critics argue that the UN is corrupt, inefficient, and often works against American interests. Instead of pouring billions into a broken system, the U.S. could redirect funding to alternative alliances. A. The UN is corrupt and inefficient. For decades, the UN has been plagued by waste, scandals, and bureaucracy. Peacekeeping failures. Despite receiving billions in U.S. funding, UN peacekeeping missions have failed to stop genocides and conflicts. Examples of failure: Rwanda, 1994. The UN failed to stop the genocide, where 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. Bosnia, 1995. UN peacekeepers failed to prevent the Srebrenica massacre, where 8,000 Muslims were executed. Haiti, 2010. UN peacekeepers brought cholera, causing 10,000 deaths. Why should America keep funding an organization that repeatedly fails to prevent atrocities? Widespread corruption and scandals. The Oil for Food scandal, 2003, revealed massive corruption inside the UN. UN peacekeepers have been accused of sexual exploitation in Africa and Haiti. Bureaucracy wastes resources, high salaries for UN officials, luxury travel, and mismanaged funds. Would the U.S. accept this level of corruption in any other government program? B. The UN undermines U.S. interests. The UN often opposes America's key policies, despite being largely funded by U.S. taxpayers. Anti-American resolutions. The UN General Assembly regularly votes against U.S. interests on issues like Israel, Cuba, and Iran. Example: in 2017, the UN condemned Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, even though the U.S. provides most of its funding. UN agencies attacking the U.S. and its allies. The UN Human Rights Council focuses on criticizing America and Israel, while ignoring China's and Russia's human rights abuses. The World Health Organization, WHO, was criticized for mismanaging COVID-19 and being influenced by China. If the UN doesn't even support the U.S., why should America keep paying for it? C. Alternative alliances. Does America even need the UN? Some argue that the U.S. doesn't need the UN to maintain global leadership, and could instead rely on other alliances that better serve its interests. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Unlike the UN, NATO is a military alliance of U.S. allies and has successfully deterred threats like Russia. Conclusion and call to action. Should America keep funding the UN? The United Nations is a double-edged sword for the United States. On one hand, it was created with American leadership to prevent global conflicts, promote diplomacy, and maintain stability. The U.S. remains the largest financial backer, contributing billions of dollars annually to keep the UN running. In return, America gains diplomatic leverage, international legitimacy, and a global platform to influence key decisions. But on the other hand, the UN often works against U.S. interests, passing resolutions that oppose American policies, allowing corruption and inefficiency to waste resources, and sometimes failing at its own missions. Many critics argue that America is funding an organization that doesn't support it, and that China is already maneuvering to take control. So the question remains, is the UN a necessary investment for America's global leadership, or an outdated, corrupt institution draining U.S. taxpayer money? The U.S. could shift military funding from the UN to NATO, ensuring defense spending is used more effectively. Bilateral and regional alliances. The U.S. could form direct partnerships with friendly nations instead of working through a bureaucratic UN system. Example: the Quad Alliance, US, Japan, India, Australia, countering China's rise. Instead of wasting money on the UN, should the US invest in more effective alliances? Final question: reform, withdraw, or stay the course? Should the US stay and push for reforms? Should it leave and let China take control? Or should it create alternative alliances instead? Let me know in the comments. Should America keep funding the UN or cut ties completely? What do you think? Sound off in the comments. This debate is far from settled, and now it's your turn to weigh in. Should the US defund the UN, reduce its contributions, or pull out completely? Or should America stay involved and push for reforms to make the UN work better? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we want to hear what you think about this global power struggle. Engage with others, reply to different viewpoints, and let's have a real discussion. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this breakdown of U.S. foreign policy and the future of global organizations, make sure to like this video to help more people see it. Subscribe for deep dives into history, politics, and global affairs. Share this video with friends and family. This is a debate that affects us all. What's next? Watch our next video on what happens if the U.S. leaves the UN. Link in description. Thanks for watching History Revealed, where we uncover the truth behind the headlines. See you in the next video.